AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I am delighted to have two guests. My co-host in the Interviewer is Paul Hollingsworth. Paul spent 27 years at CIA in both analytic and operational roles, with 3 overseas tours and a couple of rotational assignments at the FBI NSC. After he left the agency, he worked as the senior intelligence advisor on Europe and Eurasia to the large energy firm BP. Before joining government, Paul was the managing editor of Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute, and he has a BA from Georgetown and an MA and PhD from Berkeley. And I'm very pleased to say Paul is our new AFIO president. Paul, welcome to AFIO Now.
Hey, thank you very much for arranging this. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to Sean Wiswesser today. Full disclosure, I joined the agency about 10 years before Sean, so our careers overlapped by about 15 years at CIA. So I knew him professionally then, and I got to know him personally then, including with socializing with his family. So this is a friendly interview because we've been friends for going on 25 years. The one thing that really impressed me about Sean when I knew him at the agency was, unlike a lot of case officers, Sean is a scholar at heart. He had studied history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as an undergraduate. He's got a master's in strategic studies from the Air War College. So he was always a learner there, not just about the tradecraft, but about the history of espionage and intelligence and national security and history in general. So I was delighted when it turned out that he wrote a book in retirement, that he has a book coming out on April 21st to be published by the Naval Institute Press, dedicated to a study of the Russian intelligence services focused on their tradecraft. Not so much a history of Russian intelligence or Soviet intelligence, but just the nuts and bolts of how the Russian services work today, particularly how they work against the United States. So I'm delighted that Sean has found in retirement, sort of going back to his roots, to sort of rediscover his intellectual curiosity about the entire field. So welcome, Sean. I don't know how much you want to introduce about yourself, but I'll give you a couple of minutes and then we'll start the interview.
Yeah, sure. Great. So first, thank you for this great opportunity. Jim, thank you for your stewardship of AFIO for many years. Appreciate all you did for us CIA retirees now that I'm one of them past few years. So it's great to meet you on air and appreciate all you've done for us. Paul, likewise, we appreciate you taking the reins now as a new president of AFIO. And of course, as you mentioned, we're personal friends. You were always someone I respected as a mentor. You've given me a lot of really good advice over the years, and you and your wife certainly care about our family, and you've shown that over the years. So this is an honor for me, and it's particularly meaningful to be able to do a pod with someone that I respect and consider a friend so many years. So thank you.
Sean, let's do a quick PR blurb for your book. So it's being published on April 21st. Are there any public book launchers that people could attend along the East Coast?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So the biggest one that folks can dial into remotely as well is the Spy Museum, International Spy Museum. On 30 April is having me starting at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. They're having a very large event in their auditorium. I'm going to be interviewed about the book by their historian, Mark Jacobson. But then they're offering 1,000 spots online. So that's a great opportunity, folks that can't be in D.C. If you can be there in person, please come. If you can't be, it's a great opportunity to dial in online and ask questions and be engaged on Russian tradecraft. And then the other event in D.C. is also 4 May at the Institute of World Politics. Paul, our colleague Glenn Korn, is a professor there. He helped me arrange an event. So the Institute of World Politics on 4 May, starting at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. That is only an in-person event, but they have a large auditorium for about 100 folks. Anyone that can join there. We're going to talk about Russian hybrid war, which is a topic of the book as well. So I also post all my events and things that I'm invited to. I'm giving a talk at a at a private, well, it's a closed event for state, local, and federal leaders in Florida here in April, but that's not open to the public. But I post all of that content on my LinkedIn profile too. So thank you for that, Paul. Appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, Sean, I'd like to put this book to as much publicity as possible because it's, as I think you try to say at pains in the book, that it's meant as a toolkit for people to understand what a adversary is trying to do to American interests. And so the more people can read it and understand the sort of diagnostic aspects of your book, the more they can understand what's being done to them that may or may not be evident at the time. So I'm a big fan of the book. Let me begin, Sean, by just asking you a psychological question about your own sort of path to writing this book. I like all three of us, we spent a lot of our professional tours, our career undercover. So we didn't acknowledge our agency affiliation while we were working. But then, like many, many people today, we dropped cover afterwards. I found that a hard experience. So I'm just going to ask you, briefly to say, well, what was the psychology of your dropping cover and writing a book? Because you went from working in the shadows of the U.S. national security apparatus to suddenly being an author talking about your career. In fact, this book is shot through with personal anecdotes from your career that reveal a lot about stuff that ordinarily we would sort of take to our grave.
Yeah, so it was not an easy decision. We can return to this later if we have more time towards the end. We can talk a little bit about how families sort of play into our work because it's so important. I know that all those members out there will appreciate it. I talked about this quite a bit with my wife, concerns we had about being out in the open with Russian intelligence and their reputation. My wife grew up in the Soviet Union. She's Lithuanian. She certainly knows the dangers and existential threat that Russian intelligence is to the West. She experienced it in her lifetime, and her family suffered under their yoke. So it was something we thought about carefully. But Paul, we all take risks in our careers for CIA. I served my country abroad quite a bit, as we all did. I served in war zones, but for me, I always felt the greatest threat of operations that I did was meeting with and dealing with Russians. While I have the most profound respect for Russian agents that helped us, they play a lot of games. There's a lot of tradecraft tricks that they play. So I felt, though, that it's really important to expose their tradecraft. The book is unique, as you said, in that it has 10 chapters focused just on their tradecraft, on how they do espionage, how they target the West, Putin's secret war against the United States and our allies, that I don't believe has got enough attention. So it was a mission and a passion I continued on from my career at CIA and in the broader intelligence community. It was one that in the latter 10 years of my career, I spent a lot of time in joint duty assignments and traveling across the community. I mentioned in the introduction of the book, worked a lot with FBI and other agencies. And so this was a continuation of that mission. But the decision to break cover and write this book and be out in the open like this was not one that we took lightly or easily in my family. But thank you for asking.
Thanks. Appreciate that. I know it's a tough decision for everybody who does it. So this is a very rich book. Even though it's only 200 pages of text, it's tightly organized. It was very economical in its language. It's got a nice layout, the way that the press has put it together. So it can act as a reference book if people want. It's an easy to read, easy to find stuff the way you said that you've organized in 10 chapters. So because it's so rich, I'm not going to discuss every single aspect of the book. That would take us a long time. I'm just going to ask you to talk about a couple of the main points. So of the 10 elements of Russian tradecraft that you identify in the book, what would you say is the least understood by Western policymakers? In other words, if you had to sit there in the Oval Office and explain to a room full of the president's cabinet, what would be the one you think that they would least be able to understand without you trying to really educate them?
Yeah, I think that ironically, the one that's gotten the most attention in recent years, I think, is still the least understood. Russian active measures, Paul, as you well know, what they call активные мероприятия. The Russians have changed the term in recent years. They call them measures of support now. Under the SVR in particular, they have an entire directorate devoted. So chapter 9 of the book, I talk about active measures, but I think for all the discussion of active measures, starting with the election meddling the Russians did in 2016, their goals and their tradecraft are still not understood and in the proper context. Paul, active measures, of course, the KGB definition going back decades into the Cold War and through the Cold War back to the early days of the Cheka and the NKVD and then the KGB. The Russians, the Soviet services, and then the Russians, they've always used active measures to influence and meddle in politics and political debates. The term measures of support that active measures are known by, they're supporting their Russian or Soviet policies. But I think that what's most understood now, particularly in recent years, is what were the goals? The goals are undermining our very democracy. The goals are to attack our systems. Fundamentally, the Russian intelligence services, particularly the FSB, the internal service, as you know, Paul, their goal is protection of the regime, protection of the single personality of Vladimir Putin running Russia right now. And he's been in power longer than any Soviet or Russian ruler, including the czars, all the way back. Catherine the Great and Joseph Stalin are the only two that have ruled Russia longer than Putin now. So those services want to keep him in power. Democracies are a mortal threat to Putin. So active measures are designed to undermine the very idea that democracies offer a way for people to free and fairly choose who's going to rule them and who's going to make decisions on their society. So for Putin, that's an existential threat. The color revolutions that took place in the early 2000s, Georgia, Ukraine, of course, Kyrgyzstan, those were and still are a mortal threat to Putin, that he can't allow democracies thriving on his borders like there are in the Baltics, like Ukraine is struggling to become, but still strives to be a democracy. So I think that what's been lost in the West, Paul, and it's not just the United States that was attacked in elections. Brexit was attacked in the UK. The Russians are doing it every day across Europe, trying to meddle in social media, now increasingly using cyber and cognitive warfare to strengthen these active measures. The goal is fundamentally to turn our societies against each other, to undermine our democracy from within. Any support of any one candidate or another is incidental to their larger mission. And that's what I would say if I was in the Oval Office, what I would focus on. So.
And that's interesting, because one thing I noticed when I read the book is it's not weighted that way by volume of print that you've devoted to the different 10 things in the toolkit. It comes across that way in the way that you say it. So, but you devote only 19 pages to active measures in Chapter 9, but 30 pages to illegals in Chapter 3. And by your account, maybe it's different in other countries in the United States, but the illegal program in the U.S. has been a spectacular failure from the Soviet period through the Russian period. So did you feel the need to write an extra lot about the illegals because of the popularity of programs like the Americans that have people rooting for Russian intelligence officers inside the United States? Or did that just fascinate you enough that you said, I'm just going to devote a lot of time to that? But then what you say is the impact of the work against us, sort of the trade.
So the way I organized the book, Paul, you're an astute reader and observer, very well stated and very good observations. The way I structured the book, though, I had to do some background on the services. That's some of the content some of the reviewers like the least, is organizationally, structurally. But it's a fundamental background of the Chekist tradition and the Chekist mentality, or the Cheka, the Extraordinary Committee, as it's called, Чрезвычайный комитет, as you all know, Paul, you have excellent Russian. I had to give that background, but a lot of people thought the early part of the book was dry in the early readings. So we jump in with the illegals in Chapter 3 because they are out there with the Americans. They're in movies. Anna Chapman's a exciting personality, although I point out fundamentally a horrible spy. She was a disaster. Her street work's a disaster, and I share those insights from the Ghost Stories cases and other illegals. Because it is exciting, it grabs attention. That's part of writing a book. I will tell you, thank you for asking the question in terms of structure. I reserve the most important content to my mind as author are the final chapters of the book. I point out to folks, I said, really, please make sure you get to chapters 8, 9, and 10, which focus on sabotage, special operations work, which is raging all across Europe. Another podcaster asked me, what would you do if you wrote the book differently today? I would have doubled the chapters on sabotage and active measures, to your point, Paul, because since I finished the book over a year ago now, they've only gotten more attention, and rightly so, in Europe. And then fundamentally, I believe still the longest chapter in the book, certainly one of the longest, is on Ukraine. And so we can talk about that some if you like, but it's on the Ukraine war. And nowhere is it more stark, the fight for democracy, the fight against the Russian intelligence services and their malevolence and their security structure than in Ukraine. So I believe the most important chapters really in the book are 8, 9, and 10, but there's a lot of other flavor and juicy details and stories and anecdotes in between. Yeah,
and that is true, by the way, for the audience. There's a lot of, each chapter's got lots of colorful anecdotes and that really help bring the Tradecraft to life. But I take that, I understand that, because I when I was reading the chapter on active measures, I kept thinking, well, your book is about the United States, and you're writing for an American audience about operations being done against American interests. But the book is, that particular chapter could be talked about Polish parliament elections in 2023, or the upcoming elections in Hungary on April 12th, in which the Russians are actively using the same playbook we've seen to try to use all tools that they have as you say, support their foreign policy through Tradecraft. So those are very prescient chapters for things that are happening parallel to the United States today. So well done. The one thing, actually, reading the book, I thought, having spent 2 years at the NSC, I thought the thing I had the hardest time explaining to policymakers was the concept you develop at length in your chapter on Maskirovka, that is, the Russian use of denial and deception in operations and foreign policy is an extension of that. And most Americans want to take at face value the stuff that they see or the stuff that they hear from Russian interlocutors, and they play on that both tactically and strategically. So I wonder if you would talk just a little bit about how Maskirovka works, particularly for active measures. I mean, how do they hide their hand? It can be whether strategic or it can be tactical. We'll pick a couple of examples, either out of the book or something you thought about, and just start talking about Maskirovka, denial and deception, which Americans, we don't practice offensively.
Exactly.
Americans don't tend to know about it.
Well, thank you, Paul. Excellent question. That lets me elaborate on quite a few things from the book. So I'll share a story. Just in the book, I talk about a lot of interaction with Russian intelligence officers and that helped the United States. Some of them were defectors, some out there that I worked with overseas. And I remember asking a Russian intelligence officer once, I said, I was asking about the concept of denial and deception. I said, so how do you practice it in your service? Maskirovka, how do you break it out? And I'll never forget what he told me. Very smartly, he said, what do you mean break it out? There is no breaking it out. It's fundamental to everything we do. Every intelligence operation, we always use Maskirovka. So, so you don't consider it a separate discipline to tradecraft? The Russians call pravila konspiracji tradecraft. No, Maskirovka is foundational to everything we do. So as you point out, Paul, for the United States, it's a big deal if we want to engage in denial and deception or covert action authorities. For the Russians, it's just part and parcel of everything they do. Let's look at an example that I break down in the book, a template of how the SVR and their active measures directorate, how they do an active measure. The first thing they're looking for, which I use the term SVR politology to explain, is they fundamentally teach about the targets that they have in the West, countries, political parties, politicians. They focus on where are the weaknesses that we, the SVR, can focus on in order to achieve policy aims of our president. So the first thing is they're identifying issues, and usually they're emotional issues. So in the case of the 2016 election, they're focusing on the things that tend to divide American society, whatever the issue may be, guns rights, LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, wherever you stand on these issues, that's what they're going to target. Secondly, then they look for a means to influence. What's the active measure they're going to use? Are they going to try to use a journalist or an academic, what they sometimes call idiots, meaning people that they can allow to promulgate Russian ideas without even knowing that they're doing it? Or are they going to use an agent? They'll actually just pay a journalist. We want you to write stories like this. Or increasingly, more and more, it's cyber operations and social media. So in the case of the 2016 and 2020 elections, and as you noted, Paul, every election happening across Europe right now, they're looking for ways to influence the discourse. Nowhere is it more clear what they were trying to accomplish than the investigations done, for instance, by Facebook that pointed out down to the same issue being argued, the same exact minute, Russian trolls were arguing the two different sides of the same debate. The only goal they had was to amp up the discourse and emotion to levels that Americans are feuding and fighting with one another, the distrust. Now, to your point, Paul, Maskirovka is the third and final key element. It's the most important one. This is where the Russians throw in a lot of these false flags and confusing narratives. For instance, that Venezuela managed to provide or hack voting machines in the United States, something that former Attorney General Barr said in his words is complete, quote, bullshit. So we looked at that. There's absolutely nothing to it. Those are the type of narratives the Russians either provide or they amplify. And they keep playing on those in social media. Cognitive warfare now takes what a Russian troll, a person might have been able to post 100 posts a day. Now with cognitive warfare, they can post 1,000 or 10,000 or more. And so the danger is really heightened. And so that's the template. Identify the issue, look at the means to influence it with active measures. And then Maskirovka is really key. Make sure that we provide any narrative, somebody else is involved, somebody else is meddling. Venezuela machines that don't work. Venezuelans hacking the United States system. How successful were they? Paul, the very fact that we're still talking about these issues this much later after the 2016-2020 election unfortunately shows how much disunity and discord they cause in the United States. And that's why in my book, I don't talk about any one candidate or another. It's about fundamentally what they're trying to do to the United States. It really rubs me and other intelligence professionals and others that are trying to fight this cause. It's really about much more broad than any one candidate or another.
Thanks. Really helpful. Yeah, it's a great cautionary part of the book. You mentioned Ukraine before, so let's just pivot to Russia-Ukraine, because that tends to be what people want to know about today when they ask about Russian intelligence. So that's an answer a paradox for me, Sean. The president of Russia for the last 25 plus years is a former KGB officer. He came up on the first chief director, so foreign intelligence, with assignments in East Germany and domestically Leningrad. And in middle of the 1990s, he was actually the head of the domestic intelligence service, so the FSB, so comparable sort of to our FBI, but not really. So this is a person who is steeped in intelligence tradecraft, steeped as a practitioner and as a leader and then as a policymaker. Yet, as you point out in the book, he tried to use intelligence to achieve his aims in Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. And we're still talking about that 4.5 years later since the invasion. So how do you square that circle? How does somebody who understands intelligence as well as Vladimir Putin does try to use intelligence and seems not to have achieved his strategic aims?
Yeah, I think, Paul, on the chapter in Ukraine and in my book, case study on the Russian intelligence services and how they planned the Ukraine invasion of 2022 and then how they carved out key roles for themselves. My argument is that they fundamentally failed the Russian state and the Russian people and their leader, Vladimir Putin. Now, the decision to invade Ukraine both in 2014 and 2022 is squarely on the shoulders of the dictator himself. Nobody else rules Russia except for him. But those services, from my experience, from open sources, from everything I document in the book, and I'm very proud of the 270 some citations where I've documented very carefully what's out there already and what we know and don't know. What we know is that the FSB, for instance, Paul, had a very prominent role in the planning of the Ukraine war in 2022 in particular, that their fifth service used to be the fifth department of the KGB back in the old days, in charge of operational analysis, in charge of delivering that analysis to the president, that they were very optimistic to the point that Russian bloggers, like I highlight in the book, Russian bloggers were very enthusiastic about the war. But in the early weeks and months when things started to fail, you get these stories leaking out from the Russian blogosphere about FSB senior officers who had picked out apartments for themselves in Kiev, that they wanted such and such apartment building. So that's how confident and cocky they were about what would happen and what they would accomplish. Now, there were key turning points in the early invasion. The failed assault by GRU, Spetsnaz, and other forces, air assault forces at Hostomel airport outside Kiev. Had they succeeded there, who knows where the coup they had planned would have succeeded or not. But fundamentally, they were too sure of themselves, too sure that Russia could pull off a short war. I've been published on the Russian air power failures. I was in a couple books with Army War College and Routledge Publishing in the UK. So I touched on the fact that Russia certainly wasn't prepared for a long war. There was absolutely no way the Russian military and Russian Air Force could have engaged in a long war, and I think they knew that. But it was really the Russian intelligence services, Paul, that were pounding their chest and telling Vladimir Putin, we can do this, Vladimir Vladimirovich. We got this. We're going to handle it. We got this taken care of. And of course, the Ukrainians have fought valiantly and defended their country nobly. But yeah, I put the blame squarely on the shoulders of the FSB, GRU, and SVR.
And since you mentioned all three services, I do want to say that's one aspect of the book I really liked a lot. Most Americans, if they think about Russian intelligence, think about the KGB, particularly the first chief directorate, that is their spies outside, or about the second chief directorate, what is now the FSB, that is their counter-espionage, counterintelligence work inside. But you spent a lot of time on this book, or you give equal time to the GRU, which most people have probably never heard of, except in a couple of famous cases in the past. And certainly not until recently when they were involved in a lot of assassinations and assassination attempts overseas, particularly in Great Britain, have they gained some notoriety. But you give sort of equal time to all three, and particularly illuminate the GRU, which I really respect. So, sort of as an exit question to end our interview today, let me ask you to look forward a bit. I mean, you mentioned the role of these three services in such policy matters as Ukraine, a huge policy decision. Putin turns 74 this year, I think, in October. Maybe he'll go on for many more years. Both his parents lived in their late 80s. Maybe he'll have a heart attack tomorrow. He's long outlived the life expectancy of a Russian male born in 1952. So we don't know what'll happen. But Whatever happens, those three services are going to be in the policy mix to decide who rules Russia after him. So if you can, I know this is a huge topic, but I mean, can you sort of give us a thumbnail sketch of what you think are the things that unite them in trying to figure out how to rule Russia after Putin's passing, or that would points of tension that would lead to divisions, sort of like 1953 when Stalin died, and there were tensions that led to a different outcome than Lavrentiy Beria thought. So just sort of, you can look at the prognostication mirror, crystal ball forward and say, okay, these three services, given a chance, what happens when Putin dies?
Yeah, great. It's a topic I enjoy speculating on. I published a piece last month as I titled it, After Putin, or After the War After Putin, since Ukraine and his idea of conquering Ukraine that hasn't worked out. It was so fundamental to his vision of his legacy. Where are we with Putin? First, I'm a believer, Paul, like you said. Unfortunately, I think Putin is largely in good health, despite all the rumors and speculation. He's constantly defied those rumors and goes out and plays hockey or rides a tiger naked on the top of a tiger, or all the things he does to show himself half naked and out in the woods bivouacking. So I think he is largely in good health. But the succession debate is an interesting way, as you say, to highlight where do the services coalesce. And the first thing I believe that they all understand fundamentally is that their future, the Russian intelligence services, is very much tied to this constant, in their minds, eternal conflict with the United States and with the West. It's fundamental to the Chekist mentality, Paul, as you well know from your experience. This is the KGB that Vladimir Putin grew up in, literally. He admired the story of Sterlitz, the illegal who penetrated the Gestapo, and talks about his admiration for those books and movies. And he wanted to join the KGB from an early age. So they believe in this mythology that they're defending the Soviet and then Russian state from all the evils of the United States and the West. But the shame of it, of course, is that what's missing from their narrative is what did they do to make Soviet society better or Russian society today? And that's where the corruption comes into play, Paul. So the one thing they're all going to have in common is this belief that they are the saviors of Russia, and that, by the way, they're entitled to graft, stealing, corruption at every level. At the highest level of services, tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars they steal for the state so that their leadership can go build their golden palaces among the Siloviki, which is why, of course, Navalny was in prison and later killed, because Navalny focused on that corruption. So that corruption unites them. Now, the divisions between them, as you know, Paul, is that they hate each other fundamentally, too. The FSB hates the GRU. They certainly hate their former first chief directorate counterparts from the KGB out at SVR headquarters at Yasenyeva. I think the FSB generally considers them elitist. Of course, the SVR and GRU are worried about the growing power of the FSB and how they've become the Uber security service in Russia, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. So what they will all agree with is that they want to keep ruling Russia. They want the power. They want the authority. They want the ability to repress the Russian people and continue their constant fight against democracy in the West. And that's why we need to be united as an alliance, NATO, and our allies in fighting them and realizing I talk about in the book, Paul, the Glavny Protivnik, the main adversary, the main enemy. I asked a Russian intelligence officer early in my career, hey, why do we have to keep being the Glavny Protivnik for the Russian intelligence services? Like President Bush, and I thought President Putin had agreed, why can't we all get along? Well, they don't want to get along with us. They don't want to allow democracy within their borders. They can't have that. So what I personally believe, Paul, and you talk about what's likely to happen, I personally believe the Siloviki, they have the stronghold on power. They're going to decide who's going to rule Russia after Putin. He may eventually name an heir. There's a lot of candidates being discussed. But I think, unfortunately, fundamentally, that Chekist mentality is going to endure. That's what's going to unite their services, despite all their differences among each other. And it's why we need to remain aware and alert to the threat of their services, always attacking us, always trying to undermine democracy and go after freedoms around the world. That, unfortunately, I worry is going to endure.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean. Yeah, you say something which I think Americans have a hard. Americans always want to say, okay, the FSB is like the FBI and the SVR is like the CIA, and somehow the GRU is like DIA or Defense Human Service or something like that, when, in fact, each of those services represent vast empires of corporate interests, industrial interests, and commercial activities, et cetera. So they have enormous stakes in who runs the government, right? Because there are advantages to them of policy shifts one way or the other, or money shifts in contracts, et cetera. So they will be players in a way that in that 2029, America will have a different president, and we'll have a new head of the FBI probably, and a new head of the CIA. The way that happens every election, we get new cabinet chiefs. But that doesn't happen there, given the stakes of the entire network responsible for its own, trying to make sure that its interests are protected. So that's a great conclusion. Sean, once again, I want to thank you for taking time to talk to us today. Our AFIO Now members come from all across the intelligence community. So there's different people out there with different interests. And I think you touch on almost everybody's interest, both in this interview, but certainly in the book, which I can't recommend highly enough. As I said before, it can be a useful reference book, and you've written it in a way which is entertaining and engaging. But you could put it up on the shelf and you could pull it off and read a chapter on surveillance methodology. And you could look at the index to see where to go to get information. So I think it's both entertaining and it's thought-provoking, but it's also a great work to have on your shelf if you ever get asked a question or have to make yourself smart in a hurry. So well done. Congratulations to you for birthing this baby, and good luck with the book launches.
Well, thank you, Paul. Again, it is an honor to be on with you, with AFIO, all my brothers and sisters from across the intelligence community, folks that knew me late in my career, especially past 10 dozen years of my career. They would always tell you, Sean is an interagency guy. Very proud that when I retired, I got a lot of support, messages of support and affection from brothers and sisters in the FBI, HSI, other agencies. One of them that was very touching for me was an FBI surveillant who told me, Sean, this is a sad day for FBI. We've lost a very strong ally at CIA. So I believe in interagency. I wrote the book with a tribute very early on to my brothers and sisters still in the fight out there. I know all of FIO's efforts are supporting, of course, our intelligence community and its retirees. So this was a great honor, Paul. Thank you and Jim again for giving me a chance to talk about the book. I hope folks will consider buying a copy. It goes towards a great cause. Naval Institute Press is the benefactor. They're an outstanding organization that benefits the U.S. Navy and its mission and its publications. So thank you so much for this. I appreciate it, Paul.
Good luck, Sean. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
This has been a fascinating conversation between two genuine experts. It's been a real privilege just to sit in and listen to it. Again, the name of the book is Tradecraft, Tactics and Dirty Tricks. Comes out in middle April by Sean Wiswesser. I want to thank Paul Hollingsworth and Sean for a really great interview.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers